haircut. Speaking of which, you know who else has got a nice, fresh fly cut? Who finally got himself to go to a supercuts? That's right, it's Miles Morales. So, like I mentioned in the previous video, the Last of Us video was meant to be a discussion between myself and Malik, and when we initially recorded that, we sort of ended it with a little brief coda about the announcement trailer for Spider-Man Miles Morales coming for the PS5. And so I figured I would make a short little off-the-cuff video about that trailer as well. It's a pretty short trailer, all things considered, when you take into account the actual game footage that we get to see. It's not all that much, but it's finally letting us play around as the Miles Morales Spider-Man in that world. And it's interesting to see some people's reactions and theories about, like, what's the story going to be, and specifically, what does Miles being Spider-Man, how does that reflect on Peter's presence, and what is Peter's presence, if anything, in this game going to be? I think it goes without saying that Peter is still alive. I highly doubt that this is going to be set, like, in the far future, as in, like, post whatever the direct sequel to the PS4 game will inevitably be. Sony and Insomniac themselves have kind of been a little inconsistent and up in the air with what exactly this game is. I've heard it compared to Uncharted Lost Legends, which isn't a thing that I've played, but seems to be just a part of a larger franchise that's its own sort of side story that functions as a complete game, but is very clearly not the mainline, major focus product. What I expect, personally, is that we'll get this sort of side story to tide us over until the next game, which will come in 2 or 3 or 4 years afterward. And in that game, we'll get to play as both Peter and Miles. A lot of people had the sort of knee-jerk, instinctual response that Miles being costumed Spider-Man would mean that Peter would have to die to make that happen. I sort of get where they're coming from, but I think there's more than enough precedent at this point for Peter and Miles being Spider-Man and acting in tandem, and I've heard some arguments to the effect of it kind of is unfortunate if Miles just has to be basically like Spider-Man B. But I do think that him getting his own game here, you know, gives him the spotlight that you would want him to have. And it's a very good-looking game. It already, I think, is kind of a good showcase for the PS5 with just the little bits that we see of this trailer. It already kind of puts visuals of Spider-Man PS4 to shame. And that's not like to be dismissive of that game. I still think that game looks gorgeous. But, I don't know, like, particularly in what looks to be the CG cutscenes for Miles. Like him walking down the street, like that shot of him in the jacket where it's just at his back, that looks so cool. And there's so many action shots where I'm like, wow, I didn't know it would take us this little time, like just 2 years, to get to a point already where we're making stuff that, like, clearly we are a generation ahead of what we were doing with the PS4. And so it feels kind of bad because I don't want to make too much of the discussion of this game, just talking about it relative to what the next game about Peter Parker is going to be, but I can't help it, but like if this game looks this good and it's only had a 2-year development cycle, then I can't wait to see what the game after this looks like that's probably going to have even much more time and money put into it. I'm interested to see what the story of this game is. Looking at the shots that we have, I'm not really able to identify any of the villains. We really don't have a lot to go on in regards to the story. The brief narration that we get from Peter in the beginning suggests that there is going to be an element of the story that's about Miles' dad, and I'm interested in that for a number of reasons. A lot of it has to do with the subject of a previous video that just came out that I'm sure many of you have watched or listened to, which is just the political climate of the time that this game is being announced and coming out in, and how in retrospect it's maybe, you know, a topic worthy of discussion, just how incredibly reverent to the police that Spider-Man PS4 is, and not to suggest that this game should be like making any explicit political statements about that, but having Miles' dad be such a big part of his story and his occupation be such like an integral part of the previous game, I'm interested to see how that's reflected here. But yeah, the map is obviously going to be the same because, you know, it's New York again, and I've got no issues with that. It definitely looks like from the brief bits of web swinging that we can see that we're going to do, you know, what has been sort of our approach with Miles up to this point, which is he has a very clearly individual way of web swinging that is distinct from Peter's, and we're incorporating like his ability to turn invisible and stuff like that. So it'll be really interesting to see the ways in which Miles plays differently to Peter, and as someone who still 2 years later is just randomly playing Spider-Man PS4 just habitually, just because of the movement and the game feel and the way that it feels to be Peter in that game. It'll be really interesting to sit down with this and go between the two and see how, if at all, the game feels different to reflect Miles being his own individual Spider-Man. Like, I expect the physics and the combat to be different in subtle ways. And then, unfortunately, this isn't Game Explain. I'm not going to do a frame-by-frame analysis, but I can say that I'm very hyped for this game, and I'm really interested to see what the story is. You can kind of hear the Spider-Verse influence in the song choice, and yeah, it'll be really interesting to have another piece of media with Miles in center stage and see how he's characterized throughout this game, and it's going to be really interesting and really fun, I think. I imagine anyone who clicked on this is hyped for this game, but what in particular are you most looking forward to, you know, seeing like be portrayed in this game? And is there anything among the number of things that I probably didn't catch that you were able to? So comment if you have anything to that effect, and like and subscribe if you haven't already. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.